Welcome to the podcast that's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist, the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee, and here with us on YouTube, and also if you're listening to the podcast, we have our head coach, Chad Timmerman. How you doing, Chad?
I'm doing well. Hi, everybody.
Our CEO, Nate Pearson.
Hello.
And we also have Cannondale and TrainerRoad's Amber Pierce. What's up, Amber?
Hey, how's it going, everyone?
We're going to answer more of the cycling and triathlon related questions that you submitted at trainerroad.com/podcast. And you can submit that every week, and we appreciate you doing so. We're streaming live on YouTube as well right now. And we're working through the bugs on the setup. So we're probably going to have a delay again this week. We thought we had it licked, and then everything kind of went crazy just before recording here. So just the same, bear with us here. But if you're watching on YouTube right now, something that really helps us is giving us a thumbs up on this video, because that will make sure that it gets pushed out to other people. And you can always hit the notification bell on our channel, and that way you always know whenever we go live or do anything else like this, post any sort of videos, and we post them every day. So we really appreciate it if you are listening with us right now. First things first, Nate, we're hiring a brand designer, correct?
We sure are. So you can go to trainerroad.com/jobs. This is a remote position. I believe it's only US. I'm not doing the hiring for this job, but in general, this brand designer's role will be make things look good, kind of on marketing, everything public facing. This is not app design. This is like the website, social, things like that. We really need someone to take that and photos, things, all that sort of stuff. So go to trainerroad.com/jobs if you'd like to apply.
That'd be great. We'll be working together really closely with whoever that person is. So I'm really excited, all of us here in the marketing department. So it'd be great. Next thing, a lot of folks mentioning on Strava and everything else, where you can find us on Strava there and check us out and check out our rides, all that stuff. But a lot of folks asking about what to do with their training plans still, just because of the fact that events are still being delayed or canceled or rescheduled or anything else. We've mentioned this before, but that's like Plan Builder is such a perfect tool for this. So Nate, last week we mentioned the fact that you've shifted your approach and you use Plan Builder to build out a new progression toward national championships and then going into Dirty Kansas, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so you just switched gears and just committed to something else. We've talked about people continuing with the peak that they currently have, even though that their event might not happen, because there's benefits of going all the way up to peak fitness and then resetting for something. Plenty of different options. But if you have questions about how to use it right now, use Plan Builder and play around with it and just test things and see how it works. It's kind of like building that car on a builder, like a builder car website. And so you can see what it would be like, and you can check out all the features and everything else and see whatever training plan you're going to have. So I'd encourage you guys to check that out. Quick point of clarification. Chad, we got a few questions where people have said, basically asking about, I've heard Chad say before, and I'll use in quotes here, 2 days per week of intensity, close quote. Basically, like what they're getting at, or what you've mentioned there, is that doing excessive intensity in a week basically leads to a point of diminishing returns and can be damaging to your training if you really take it too far, right? But then a lot of people have asked, well, if I look at my training plan, it seems like there are more than 2 intense days. Do you want to clarify on that a little bit so some people can have a clear idea?
Sure. Yeah, I think some of the confusion might stem from the fact that a while back I designated sweet spot and above as intensity. I probably should have just said that's where, I'm not even sure. I just shouldn't have said that, because intensity typically implies that we're working above threshold. So when I say 2 days per week of intensity, I'm typically talking about VO2 max work and above. It's not to say you can't have 3 days, because the return seems to be at about 2 to 3 times per week, and I'd rather err on the side of caution in that case. And the third day is probably going to still be a hard day, but even then it's still that day on, day off, or day light sort of format. But there is plenty of data to support that once you go beyond that third one, the returns not only diminish, but they typically work against a rider. The real concern is that your hard days stay hard. So if you get to a point where maybe you're doing 2 days a week and you're contemplating or considering adding a third day of intensity in a week, and then your hard days start to suffer and you can't go as hard, then that 2 might be a breaking point, at least in your current context. And then I was listening to a Tower 26 podcast the other day, and Jim Vance was on it a little while back, and he summed it up really nicely. He said he doesn't like to put his athletes in a place where they're more than 2 days away from fully recovered. So no matter how deep a hole they dig, within 2 days, either off the bike or riding really lightly, they should be able to bounce back and have a good, probably hard day on that third day.
I don't like the term fully recovered because I feel like I'm that like twice a year, but like easy day, recovered.
Agreed.
Feeling like I do another hard day. Yeah.
Yes.
Functionally recovered.
Yeah, functionally.
Capable.
I like that. Yeah.
Capable.
Effectively. Yeah. Right. Cool. So thanks, Chad. Hopefully that clarifies things for people. Another point too that's come to our attention from a number of employees here, and then also from listeners and everything else, this is something pretty cool. I've been doing it now for the past month and a half or so, and it's basically so like the way in our notes here I put it down as like free TrainerRoad, but really it's a way to use your insurance's reimbursement programs to be able to get something. So a lot of us here listening to this, we're cyclists, triathletes, something that we're pretty active, very regularly active. And depending on the health insurance system that you may have or the company that you're with, you could be counting the workouts that you're doing, whether it's following a TrainerRoad plan, all that stuff. You could be counting them towards some sort of reimbursement. And I went through and checked in and looked at a bunch of different companies that have it. But it's also recommended that you just ask your health insurance company, because in most cases, for example, they give people that go into gyms. If you go into a gym 10 times a month, for example, you can get $20 off if you follow you, or if you use UHC like we do, you can get $20 off, which is pretty sweet, every month off of your premium. So it effectively, in this case, for sure, would make the TrainerRoad subscription effectively free, which is pretty awesome to get rewarded for that sort of thing. But it totally depends, because in some cases it's $200 a month for a 6-month period. And in some cases, I even read, like for example, with UHC, that depending on your employer, depending on the plan, depending on everything else, you can even get like bonuses basically sent to you depending on the amount of time that you accumulated over a 6-month or year-long period. And you can even use those toward buying fitness equipment. So you could get like, those sweet disc wheels or something neat like that. But some examples of some companies that work with this: Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield, Humana, Oscar, UHC or United Healthcare, AmeriHealth, Horizon, BCBSB Fit, Aetna, Cigna, and then once again, call whoever your provider is, because all the training you're doing, you might be able to actually kind of get paid for it, so to speak, or just not get charged as much from your insurance company, which is pretty sweet. So you can get some return on that. I've been using the check-in through the Rally app. It's like the app that you use with UHC. It's a little bit kind of like strung together, but it doesn't require you to check in at a specific gym. It just requires you to check in that you are at some sort of a fitness center doing your workout, which all of us, we turn our garages, our whatever it is, our living room, our office, whatever it may be, you turn that into a fitness center when you train, which is pretty sweet. So I'd check it out. Have any of you guys tried that yet? Nate, I don't know if you have.
I have not tried it yet, but so I just want to say it because this is pretty huge for people, because basically this makes TrainerRoad free if you use it 6 times a month. Is if you're on United Healthcare and an example of other companies, and I think we're going to do a blog post about this explaining it. John, is that correct?
We will. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Cool. So what you can do is every time you work out, you check in and you make your house a gym, and no one else can see that. And then at the end of the month, as long as you do 6 workouts a month, which I bet y'all are doing, it gives you $20. Boom. It's free. That's amazing. Awesome. And then this is only for Americans, because we have to pay for all of our healthcare, which I know is not, other people are just like, what's that mean? Which is weird. John, one thing that we're getting on YouTube is people are saying your mic is like cutting down, and I'm hearing the same thing. So maybe speak closer to it. We'll see if that fixes it.
Perfect. Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's a live stream thing.
Setting then.
Cool.
It's probably a setting thing, and I'll end up changing it once we go into the first question here. So for sure. So also, and one thing with that as well, it's much more common to see like this sort of thing brought up when you work at a large company. But in this case, if you don't work at a large company, because in many cases they'll have gyms, they'll have everything else laid out for you. But in this case, you don't have to work at that large company. If you just are, privately insured, even this still can totally work for you, which is pretty neat. So last bit of exciting stuff is tomorrow is Beers with Chad. That's Fridays at 2 p.m. Pacific on Instagram. Amber did an awesome job last week. Nate,
thanks.
you also did an awesome job the week before. It was different, but it was awesome just the same.
I enjoyed Amber's more.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. To be honest, I think that my heart and my life expectancy also appreciated Amber's a bit better too. So
Actually,
I
some
was
of that
pretty
Chad's
worried.
questions, the Muppets, like we did not go anywhere close to that. It's too, Chad.
Oh,
White
yeah.
socks and white shoes is a freaking amazing look. And especially with the long Rule 28 style Aero socks. This is what John wears. It's amazing. It's good. John, back me up on this.
Agree to disagree.
Yeah, I think it's a good look. Yeah, I think it's a good look. White on white is really good. I think you can also go black socks with white shoes. I feel like that looks good. But for some reason, it looks really weird to me to have black shoes and white socks. Am I alone in this?
Yeah. No, that's
think
it.
No, I fully agree on that.
I disagree. I'm okay with the dark shoes.
Yeah. I think so. I just got white shoes yesterday, and it definitely is why I had new white shoes. It's why I had a breakthrough workout. It's for sure the reason. So I'm certain of it. But for more nonsense like this, I got the S-Works Recons. So I have them in black, and man, they're so expensive. Like it's frustrating to buy these shoes because they're so darn expensive. But I've tried the Rafa Classics. I've tried the Giro. Oh gosh, whatever their Tech Lace mountain bike shoe is. I've tried that one. I even tried a Physique one. Their best like mountain bike shoe. They just don't work as well. The Recons, I put them on, and I do have custom insoles that I put in. So that is like a point to make. So like your mileage may vary and it would be different, but man, they're just so comfortable. There's like zero break-in. I put those brand new shoes on yesterday, and it was just like the ones that I've had for a year. It was like no difference. So that's really cool. I really like those shoes. Nate, you use those as well, I think, right?
Yeah, they're like kind of good for me. They're on the fence. I do get some like cleat play too with my SPD, which I don't know, pedals, which I don't know why. But the S-Works Road ones I love. And then the Recons I kind of love, but I could probably play with inserts because there is some, it feels like it doesn't fit my foot correctly. And it's like saddles, right? It's different for everybody.
Totally. The only complaint I have, and I know that this is a nitpicking complaint, and it's because I have such crazy high arches and I have a custom insole that supports my arch so it doesn't collapse too much. Because of that, the top BOA basically cuts more into my foot in an uncomfortable position. It's nothing too bad, but that's something to know that if you have a high instep, a lot of the time those BOA shoes can be really uncomfortable. So it can get bad. For anybody listening, hopefully the microphone. Yeah, go ahead, Nate. Sorry.
You sound better right now, John. And someone on YouTube, Chad, said that Sagan used to wear black shoes and white socks.
It's true. He does. I think he still does.
Still unacceptable. It's a horrible look. It's awful. Luke Rowe did it for a while. I love that guy, but it looks terrible.
For more opinion, a total lack of science and nonsense like this, you should join us on Beers with Chad. It's a ton of fun. So it's Fridays at 2 p.m. Pacific. Yeah, and this time it'll be Pete, so it'll be an absolute blast. Pete's a really fun guy to have along. We will miss having
He's got high ambitions. He's got high ambitions in terms of beer intake. You should see what he's got lined up for us. So I'm not going to hang on but halfway.
Let's be clear, though. Nate set the bar on that one. Like, yeah, and we're a competitive bunch here, so this could go somewhere interesting.
Do I need to have a discussion with Pete about Nate's bar being one that we don't reach for?
Ever.
They're not. I know what they're going to drink, and they're not even planning on getting close to it. So
okay, sounds good. Sounds good. That's somewhat relieving to hear. So, but it'll be fun to have Amber back in the comments and Nate and everything else. So, Amber and I tend to troll a bit in the comments, which is pretty fun. So, yes, join with us, troll and have some fun. It'll be great. Let's go into Ian's question. He says, hey guys, firstly, I love the podcast and training plans. Could you help me to understand recovery week a little better? And just for your information, we're going to kind of like go into recovery on a few questions here in a row. So get ready for some recovery stuff. So he says, I know that to get faster, I should put as much focus on recovery as I do into training. So what goes into getting the most out of my recovery when I have a whole week of it? If each athlete responds slightly differently to training stress, surely they will also respond differently to recovery. So with this in mind, should my recovery weeks be as specific or possibly more specific, given it is just condensed into 7 days as the rest of my training? I occasionally use recovery weeks as a mental break as well as a physical one, and we'll have a drink, although not as much as Nate, he mentions. And he says that the dude nearly chugged a whole bottle of wine on Beers with Chad. Yep. Yeah, it's impressive. And says, Yeah. He
Yeah, I
went there.
finished the wine.
And he says,
That was easy.
yeah. I remember it happened so fast. I think I mentioned this last week, but it happened so fast. I thought you poured it out like off camera. It was ridiculous. So, anyways, he says, so I tend to have a drink, and then he says, stay up late because the training stress is reduced. Is this logical, or do I need to double down on my recovery during this week? And he says, sorry for the long question. No need to apologize, Ian. He says, you got 5 stars from me a long time ago. Keep up the great work. Thanks, Ian. I appreciate it. And when he says 5 stars, by the way, people get quiet, or some people have asked, like, why in the world do you say 5 stars? It's because you can rate the podcast. So on whatever app you're listening right now, you can usually rate us. Ratings help a ton, and sharing helps even more. Like, the more you can share the podcast with other cyclists, the better.
And write a review. We're super competitive, and I want more stars than any other cycling podcast. Right? Like we do.
Yes, we must win.
Of course we do.
Exactly. So I guess, Chad, do you want to kick us off on this one? I think we probably all have a lot, but Chad and Amber, you've put down more notes. So
sure, I'll kick it off. So you pointed out a good point, Ian, in that recovery is subjective, much like training. So many things influence it. You have your age can definitely affect that rate of recovery, your training history, outside stressors, anything else that you're dealing with in life at the moment, your training load. So what brought you to that recovery week can vary from phase to phase, season to season, et cetera. But it is something that can't be compromised. So once, never minding the subjectivity of it, you have to determine what works for you. And there are some things that jump out at me that I think you could absolutely address right now that would improve your level of recovery, simply because you're missing the key to recovery is that it is in fact a necessity adaptation. I mean, you can train all you want, but if you don't give your body the necessary downtime, the adaptations don't occur. And the discipline that you carry into your training needs to be carried over to your recovery. You cannot shortchange your recovery, and probably heading that list is your sleep hygiene. So that's one of the first things you said, is that maybe you can go to bed a little bit later because your training load isn't as high. But training load or not, it doesn't really shift what happens during sleep, and it doesn't shift the timing of what happens. Different phases of your sleep happen at different times in night. So if you go to bed a little later, you're probably shortchanging one of those. If you sleep in a little later, it doesn't mean you can add it onto the other end. That's not how sleep works. So I think probably point number one is to try to hang on to your sleep hygiene. And a lot of things will affect that. Timing is absolutely one of them. All the avoidance of blue light and trying not to train close to bed. All these other things do matter. Eating is one of them. Drinking is probably even more important, because if you eat close to bed, not a big deal, or I should say not as big a deal as drinking close to bed, but it will affect your sleep. Again, I've been tracking my sleep for, probably 4 or 5 months now with an Oura ring. So, I'm not tying or hitching my wagon to any of those numbers in a hard sense. I don't look at that number and say, okay, this is my day now. I rather have noticed trends over time. And I can see when I eat late, that my body temperature stays high, that my heart rate stays high, and it takes me quite a long time to come down. I can see that if I have alcohol, I probably miss out on some of my REM sleep in the morning. I mean, there are things that I can tie to actions I take prior to going to bed, and they all carry weight. So when you have a particular pattern of activity that goes along with your training, and then you shift all that during the recovery week, you're basically adding another stressor at a time when you should be trying to reduce them. So if at all possible, try to keep your...
Sorry, quick question. I'm curious, how are you tracking your sleep?
An Oura ring. So it's a little wearable that looks like it's a ring. Yeah. And you can wear it. You can wear it 24 hours a day. I don't, because it doesn't really lend me anything relevant. I mean, it measures activity level and non-exercise activity and stuff like that. But frankly, I just use it for sleep. I just put it on at nighttime because it doesn't measure exercise heart rate for some godforsaken reason.
Since Amber jumped in, sorry for the delay too. That's why we're talking over each other. Chad, I had a question too. Have you ever gone to sleep without drinking alcohol before, to see how that affects you?
Yeah, it's funny.
Really?
I realize you're being facetious. But I have shifted.
No, I'm not.
In these COVID
Legit question,
times,
right, guys?
I've shifted my it is. I've shifted my drinking schedule so that it's earlier in the day because it just everything is pretty flexible right now. So I get my
Here's what
drinking
Chad
done
is 2 p.m.
early. And by
What about work?
yeah. No, I started at like 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and I'm a guy who starts work at 5 in the morning and is done by 1 or 2 in the afternoon. So it doesn't overlap with work. But the point is, I've noticed a direct impact on the quality of my sleep. It's been very noticeable because that alcohol intake also influences your body temperature, which means it's harder to bring your temperature down so that you can. And that's a necessary trigger for a number of things that lend to good sleep. So having that drink, once in a while, I'm absolutely in favor of. The more serious of an athlete you are, the more infrequent that needs to become. But it does carry an impact. And during a recovery week where you're trying to maximize your recovery, trying to take your recovery as seriously as your training, it's absolutely worth your concern, Ian.
Yeah. Nate, do you have something? It seems like you did.
No, there's so many. I can't
actually
say all these
have some
jokes
more,
because
but-
my comedic timing is messed up with the delay. But there are jokes that I hear in my head and I laugh to myself. And I think you can all get them because Chad, he said something like, I am absolutely in favor of drinking alcohol. Like, yes, we know, Chad. Okay,
Really?
Chad, take it away.
Okay, so the stages of recovery also apply perceptually, and I guess you could liken that to psychologically, in that they're still subjective. So all the things that influence them on a physiologic level probably to some extent influence them on a psychological level. I see it as kind of a process that you have to go through every time you reach a recovery week, in that the first day or 2 or 3, you're tired. I mean, you're obviously tired and nothing feels quite right. You have general body fatigue. You have like a malaise where nothing excites you or affects you the way it does. Food doesn't taste as good. I mean, there's so many things that can be likened to mild depression. And in some cases, it is in fact that. Your motivation's low. I mean, it's just this low point and you wonder, what is wrong with me? Why do I feel this way? But a couple of days later, you start to work your way out of it. And the next few days are this gradual return to normal. And in this, I think, is the temptation, much like coming back from illness or injury, is where people jump into things too soon. They think, I'm ready to hit it again. I'm going to do it. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't, though. So what I look for in me, especially since I'm not personally training anybody, but when I did train individual clients, was I wanted to detect some indication of an eagerness to return to training. It wasn't just that they could do the workout or they kind of wanted to do the workout. I wanted like a visible joie de vivre. I wanted to see, an actual zest for life. I wanted them to want to train and to be excited about that prospect. That to me said, recovery has, run its course, and now is the time to up the load and get after it again.
Yeah, there's I remember a while back I was coming back from illness and was finally to a point where I was like, man, I can't wait to get on the bike again. And I said it out loud to my husband one day and he goes, yeah, it probably means you need at least another day off. And I was like, wait, what? And he's like, I mean, you really want to stoke the fire. You want to really continually keep that, that hunger and that enthusiasm, like you said, that joie de vivre. I think that's such a great way to put it and frame it because it is so important. It's a really crucial component of training.
Yeah, and that what happens too is that doesn't always, to me, that's like Saturday or Sunday or sometimes even Monday of the recovery week when that comes back. It is definitely not Monday, Tuesday. Monday, Tuesday, I'm like, I went way too deep. Like I should give up cycling all the time.
Right. Sorry for the barking dog in the background. Once again, we're all in this together. Such is the time that we're in. So one thing to add to this too is that a lot of these feelings, I could see somebody listening to this and being like, hey, I feel like that not just in a recovery week. Sometimes I feel like that amidst like a training week. Like last week, for example, I had a huge amount of other training or other load in my life with getting a ton of yard work done. It's still going on, but maybe I've adapted. I don't know what the change is, but it was really tough. Like last week was really hard to go through and hit all my marks in training. And it was like over the weekend, I was just like, oh man, or coming into the weekend, I was like, I'm just not fast anymore. I'm like dropping down. Something's going on. Everything is wrong. I need to question everything. Right. And then once I made it through and I had a great ride on Saturday, I actually took the day off of structure and I went out and just rode my mountain bike. It had been a long time since I had done that, which in our local area, it's safe to do so and also legal to do so. And the place I picked was one where I wouldn't be overlapping with a lot of people. So I went through and did that and had a great ride and got a bit of that enjoyment of riding back. And man, like it's been killer. Like this week, my workouts have been so good. I've been like hitting all my marks. I'm eager to train. So sometimes even, this can happen in the middle of a training week, and it's really finding your way to do it. For me, it wasn't stepping away from structure. That's like the red herring. Really what it was just, I needed to make sure that I was putting too much emphasis and freaking out too much on all the small things that were going on. And instead, I just needed to calm my mind down and do it. And having that day off and then having another one just helped a lot. Because I think a lot of the time we're good at sabotaging ourselves at not being successful at training.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm doing a high volume, short power, high volume build right now. And I was with a rider from Four Eyes. She's in charge. I forget what her exact title is, but really cool person. And she was saying she went to sleep and she had a negative mindset because she's like, man, I am so tired. My legs hurt, all of this, like I am too deep. And we talked about it. I said, no, that was after a really hard workout. The other mindset you could have is, wow, this is exactly what I want. Like I'm tired and my legs hurt going to sleep after a hard workout. I put it in there. I put the effort in. And I know that if I recover now and the next day was easier, that I'm going to be faster. And that's the kind of state I want to be in. If I've never in a tired state where my legs hurt, I'm probably not training hard enough, or I could probably get some more volume. It's all about that mindset, right? Because one is yes, I'm doing it. This is perfect. Another is, oh my gosh, I'm panicking. I'm never going to be able to finish this training plan.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Couldn't agree more.
That's it exactly.
Absolutely.
So that's why I said, I hesitate to even call it psychological so much as perceptual. It's how you want to look at it. It's how you interpret it, which, is psychological. But I think if you frame it as, I can perceive this any way I want to, then it makes it perceptual and maybe a little more relatable. So that's on the more psychological side of things, though. If we want to return to the physiologic side of things and give you some real reasons to recognize that stuff is going on that needs to stop, needs to have a break, we can look at it in terms of hormonal re-regulation. And along with that, they basically go hand in hand as a reduction in inflammation. So certain hormones are high when we exercise. Specifically, you've heard cortisol many times, epinephrine, norepinephrine. These are all things that fall on the catabolic side of things. Basically, they're liberating energy so that we can do our workouts. And this is all good and fine in the moment. But when we keep these chronically elevated, and cortisol definitely springs to mind, we're basically getting a chronic or a consistent elevation of that sympathetic drive, the sympathetic nervous system. And this is something we have to come down from time to time. And yeah, we can come down after a hard workout over the course of the recovery day or the lighter day. But after weeks of training have accumulated, you have to have a longer detachment and allow the parasympathetic drive to ramp back up, to re-regulate. Because I can think of, nothing springs to mind. I can't think of anything that stays chronically elevated that leads to good things. Everything needs to have an ebb and flow to it. And if we think of, if you want to get really specific, there are inflammatory markers like that C-reactive protein we hear about quite a lot, and interleukin 6 and 10. And these are things that if you were to check your blood, or if you were to be on top of these biomarkers, you would see that these things have to decline at some point. And because what they're telling you is that there's inflammation, and typically this inflammation is tied to actual damaged muscles. And damaged muscles is all good and fine, again, in the short term. But when we drag that out and we repeat it, then these little proteins are accumulating in our bloodstreams. This means this means more stress on the kidneys. Again, short term, kidneys can handle it. Long term, systems start to break down. So, and then yet another perspective is, what is it doing to our GI tract? Again, short term, we can deal with this stuff. We can work through it. But over time, this can actually have lasting effects on your gut health.
Yeah, so this is why training is like periodized to this degree. It's because training in itself is stressful to the system, right? But then if you make sure you offset it with the ability to rest and recover, then it's a healthy way to manage things. And it's funny because I remember having a discussion with a friend of mine. He doesn't do any sort of like physical training at all. He occasionally maybe goes to the gym, but he's just killer at golf, basically, in cornhole. He's like really good at those two things. So not exactly super active, right? And he's like, yeah, but like all this training, man, that's really harsh for your body. And I'm like, yeah, it is. And then we started talking about it, and he's like, and he spends, he stays up till 11 at night playing NBA Live with other people on the internet and drinks a lot of Monster and drinks a lot of that. Another person takes their job in such a way that's just extremely stressful. Like in one way, we kind of pick our poison in life. Like we all have forms of stress and we all bring them on ourselves. But the one benefit, or there are many benefits, but one in particular of physical, especially endurance exercise like this and properly periodized endurance exercise, is that if managed effectively, it's very healthy, the outcome for your body. You're able to manage cardiovascular health, and you're able to do so many great things for your body. So training is stress, but life is stress as well, right? Like, and it's all about how you manage it. And that's the cool part about training. You can go ahead, Nate.
Another thing, Chad, that's so important, what you said is, this is kind of grinds my gears sometimes, is people will look at a study and they'll kind of extrapolate it. So they'll if in a 6-week study, VO2 max work is probably always going to meet for time matched any other type of work for improvement. But we can't do VO2 max 365 days a year or keep doing it, because you start to break down. So someone will see that and be like, hey, VO2 max is better than over unders. And it's like a 6-week program. And then they think that, okay, that means we should be doing that 4 years in a row every day, right? And not have this ebb and flow in training. And that's not the case. You just can't do it. People will break down. So be careful when you read those things. If it says that it's 6 weeks of doing that, be like, okay, it's very specific, right? This is 6 weeks of training with the same volume, with nothing else, and then that's it. And we do that in build. Like we do VO2 max to go bring it up. And to what Chad said earlier too, not so much that we want to bring you down so that when you hit specialty, like you're just overtraining, you don't want to do anything else. Amber, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to step back for a second and talk about, what Chad was saying between the sympathetic, parasympathetic. It's really important, that re-regulation and achieving that balance. But I think another component of this, just another layer of it, is the flexibility, the ability of your body to switch from one to the other, because it can take time. And just the ability to switch back and forth is actually something that really helps in performance. So if you think about even in a race, it might be with a different frequency and amplitude that you're oscillating between sympathetic, parasympathetic. But if you're doing a long road race, there will be moments where it's chill. Nobody's attacking. It's a time to just sort of pedal along, eat, drink, and be merry. And you want your nervous system flexible enough that you can shift back quickly into parasympathetic in those moments, so you can get these little micro recoveries in the middle of the race, which will position you better to be able to go on the attack when it heats up again. So I think in addition to the balance, we want to think about it in terms of the flexibility of being able to switch back and forth when you need to.
That is such a fantastic point. It's funny because, since I've started doing short power build, a quick aside, by the way, and this, yes, is a house ad. If you're a mountain biker, you need to do short power build. Holy cow. Like just going for that mountain bike ride the other day, it's been a long time. It was so easy just to endlessly punch out of every turn. It was so freaking cool. Like it just felt awesome. You know what I mean? Like, because that's the hard thing about mountain biking. Sorry, say that again, Nate.
Or I would say, sorry, or a crit racer.
Yeah, for sure. Crit racer, same thing, right? Like, mountain biking is hard because you kind of don't have a choice. Like you always have to punch. And when you get behind the 8-ball, those punches just really drag you down. And man, like short power build's awesome. But part of that training that I've been doing is a lot of on and off. And yesterday during my workouts, it was 3x9 or 9x3 VO2, not 3x9, but 9x3. So I had these 3-minute intervals with 4-minute rest in between. And I noticed yesterday how good I was at completely dropping myself down in between. Like I was like peaceful, downright peaceful. And it was like a light switch. Like as soon as that interval ended, I was like, bam, I'm ready. I'm completely down. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as it was time to go, I was ready to ramp up. I think your body gets better at that, right, Amber? Like with time, with more experience doing it, you're able to really, there's no fudging going on. There's no convincing. Like my body calms down super quickly and then it ramps back up. It's a skill to have because that's what gives you the clarity when you're in those technical moments in a race, like a tactical moment and you're trying to figure out what to do. If you can have a more level head on your shoulders, you're at a huge advantage, right?
Totally. If the race eases up and you have a kind of a quiet moment where you can relax and get something to eat, if you can't chill it out for a second, relax your mental focus, relax your body, take that moment to take on some extra fuel, you're really missing a key opportunity to refuel, restore both mentally, physically, and even calorically, to prepare for what is inevitably going to come, at some point later in the race, whether it's 2 minutes from now or 10 minutes from now. It's going to heat up again, and it's really hard to do it. But to your point, it's very trainable. It's very trainable, and doing making sure that you're recovering well. Kind of, again, going back to like frequency and amplitude, this can happen many times within a ride, but from week to week, paying attention to your recovery in all these ways that Chad's talking about, that re-regulation, again, coming back to that balance, all of it is part of training this as a skill.
This is like the Russian doll of training, right? In the sense that like everything scales up. Like you have the Russian nesting doll, right? Where it's like you're talking like between intervals of work and rest, then you're talking about rest days during a week, and then you're talking about loading and deloading phases, and then you're talking about it on a much larger scale too, where you build all the way up to a peak and then you take some time off, and then even multi-year plans. Like it's the same principles. So it's really important to understand them at any level because it applies across all of them. Chad, is there anything
it's
else? It's recovery
inception.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I think I covered everything I wanted to say.
Cool. Steven's question then. He says, hey, coaches, obligatory, huge fan of the podcast, or huge fan of TrainerRoad and the podcast. Definitely not obligatory, Steven, but we appreciate it. So believe it or not, I read every question and consider all questions equally despite any sort of praise given. So we just appreciate the praise. And the vast majority of you put praise in beforehand, which is really kind and awesome. So thank you for doing that. He says, I've been using it to train for my first full Ironman triathlon, which of course has been postponed, but I've come to really love the workouts, and Plan Builder is definitely coming in handy. My question today is a simple recovery question. I was wondering if there's any data on the effect of, and he says in quotes, legs up the wall, unquote, position after a workout. For whatever reason, I seem to really enjoy laying on my back with my legs at a near 90-degree angle up the wall. And I was wondering if this is actually an effective recovery position, because this is definitely something that you hear a lot of people talk about, like a way to recover. So that's where he came up with this. It's not like Steven just came up with this crazy thing out of his own mind. He's on the right track here. So he says, any research out there on this position being effective for recovery? Thanks in advance. Chad, do you want to kick us off on this?
Yeah, short answer, Stephen, no. But there is, this is an opportunity to discuss some things that maybe lead people to this understanding. And there is plenty of anecdotal evidence to support why that there would be some benefit to this. However, I didn't find a single study. If anybody has one, feel free to send it to us, but it's only going to back up what a lot of these internet experts seem to think. There's definitely some misunderstanding surrounding this. And a lot of people speak with some real authority on a matter that has nothing to back it up. So that's always fun. This I see as an opportunity to kind of clarify what is the lymphatic system, because quite honestly, up until just a couple of years ago, I just figured it was part of the circulatory system. I didn't even realize it was a whole alternative system that did a very specific thing. I thought lymphatic fluid was part of the bloodstream, and it just hit lymph nodes, was filtered, and was back into the bloodstream. And that's not the way it works. They're two separate systems entirely. The circulatory system. So basically what really differentiates them is that our circulatory system, which circulates, blood, oxygen, nutrients, et cetera, is a closed loop. It basically starts with arteries, oxygenated blood travels through them, and eventually whittles down to the point where we're dealing with capillaries. And this is where all the nutrient and oxygen exchange and byproducts and all that stuff is exchanged. And this is basically where the lymph system begins. So these little lymph effectively capillaries, or these inlets, are in the capillary bed, and they pick up basically some aspect or the liquid portion and a few other things that I'll get to in the blood, and they circulate it in their particular way. But back to the circulatory system, blood doesn't pool in the legs, and I know that's something that gets battered about a lot, and I understand that there are some reasons for that, but if it pooled, that would mean that there's something occluding our blood vessels, some sort of blockage, and this would lead to ischemia, and ischemia leads to tissue death. And this is nothing favorable. It doesn't work in any manner, especially not over the long term. It can happen briefly, which is something different, and I'll touch on that later. But typically, nothing good happens if the circulatory system breaks down in any way. There is, however, we've talked about in the past, where you have low blood pressure, and athletes, endurance athletes, athletes in general who are very fit, typically have lower blood pressure. The lower resting heart rate, big old stroke volumes. It's just lower blood pressure. And when you go from a sitting position to a standing position, yes, you do get that drop in blood pressure, which means your brain is a little starved for oxygen for a moment there, and you get that orthostatic hypotension that we've mentioned in the past. It's not due to pooling. Blood just hasn't stopped moving in your legs and it's collecting there. It's something. It's basically just low blood pressure. And then there's that post-race vasodilation, where we go from working muscles that are in charge of a lot of blood and blood vessels that are very dilated, and then we stop working and that dilation's still there. So there's still a lot of blood in the legs, but it's still being circulated. So it's not the same thing. It's, again, not pooling. Lymph, however, this is different because the lymphatic system is a closed system. So again, we go back to the capillary level where we have this web work of these little tiny blood vessels that are weaved through the muscle and drop stuff off and then pick stuff up. And then the lymph vessels pick up little excesses. In particular, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. So what's interesting is that blood pressure basically pushes our blood along, right? The heart beats, it creates pressure. And this is what you see when you measure your BP, and you get that maybe 120/80 sort of thing. That 120 millimeters of mercury is basically when the heart has beat. That's the highest pressure our system or our circulatory system is going to see. And then the lower end of it, when it's in diastole, either way, that's the lower number. The lymphatic system, however, doesn't have a heartbeat. It has to move through different mechanisms, and one of them is the endothelial tissue that actually lines I guess it's maybe not considered that, but anyway, the smooth muscle tissue that lines these vessels actually does do work, and it pushes the lymph along. But we can also facilitate lymph movement with a muscle pump. So when we flex the muscles, they bulge and basically enhance lymph pressure. The equivalent of blood pressure just in the lymphatic system. So it actually moves. Exactly. So just movement will facilitate the movement of lymph. And what else could possibly lend to that is gravity. And this is where the legs on the wall can, again, help move the lymph along. Because this is not a pressurized system, so to speak, it doesn't have a heartbeat that pushes the pressure way up and then it declines. Lymph has to be reintroduced into the system way late in the circulatory system. This happens when blood pressure is at its lowest. So we start at, maybe we push blood out of the heart at 120 millimeters, where lymph re-enters the system is way up at the top, where blood pressure is at its lowest, way down at like 5 millimeters of mercury. So it relies on that low pressure re-entry to funnel back into the system, redistribute these things that were pulled out, or basically redistribute the liquid that's in our blood, put it back into our circulation. And this happens to the tune of about 3 liters a day. So it's not insubstantial at all. Different parts of the body have different lymphatic composition. Our muscles, that have their own little spectrum of things within them. So the lymph system, I've pretty much already covered this, but it collects and returns fluid, basically the plasma component and some smaller proteins back into the cardiovascular system. So that's purpose number one. Purpose number two is that there's an immune component. I mean, this lymph system is basically there so that it can circulate things past our lymph nodes, so it can determine if immune response is actually merited, in which case it deals with it. Otherwise, it just pushes the stuff right along and it's back into basically the next lymph node along the way, and then eventually back into the bloodstream. And then finally, fatty acid distribution, and then smaller proteins. And that includes things like hormones and the albumin, which is our blood protein basically, and waste products. So it does a lot of things, but point being, it doesn't have the strongest, it's not facilitated, or we can facilitate it through muscle action. We can facilitate it through gravity. Let's see. Yeah, I think I pretty much covered all my notes. I skipped ahead a bit. I do have some specific takeaways. And again, just because the science isn't there doesn't mean there isn't something to this. I mean, I think we all recognize that when we do this, we feel a little better. If you've been on air travel, is one of the big culprits to sit on a plane for a long period of time. And I'm not sure what it is specific to air travel, if it's just a sitting or if it's the pressurization of the cabin, whatever. But it's not uncommon to get off a plane and have, your own version of cankles. It's not a flattering thing. And this is something that you can actually address while you sit on the plane and flex your muscles a bit and actually, again, use that muscle pump to facilitate lymph movement. You know, you're not going to put your legs up on a plane, but you can do that. When you elevate your legs, it does mean time off your legs. And this is another one of those things that all these recovery modalities that get so much press often ignore, is that in order to engage in them, we have to sit and basically do nothing. And that in and of itself is recuperative. So is it the modality that's doing the work for us? Is it just the fact that we're not doing anything else? Who knows? But with legs up on the wall, it feels good. So why not do it? If you're going to sit around anyway, why not prop the legs up and help your lymph do a bit of movement? And then finally, there's the whole psychological headspace, and a recovery process has its components. And when you follow that process, you feel like you're in the right, like you're doing the right things, and it puts you in the right frame of mind. And psychologically, I think there's a benefit there as well.
Yeah. So on the plane, you know, it's been talked about to wear compression socks, and you always think it's like maybe old people might get clots or something, but there's actually a local athlete. I forget their name, but they're in their 40s, very, very fit. They were going to a race and they got a blood clot on the flight from not moving. It was a long flight. So I think a lot of us own compression socks, and you can just get some cheap ones from the drugstore for like $20. Throw those on. John does it every year. When we go from Kona, he wears shorts and compression socks, and everyone thinks he did the Ironman. They're like, "How was the race?" John was like, "It was great.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. It was a great race." And you look like you could do Ironman.
It's not a lie.
Yeah, it was a great race.
How the race go? It was fun.
Cool thing. You're doing a stage race, or
ice cream. It's great.
If you're doing, we get smoothies usually. If you're doing the stage race and you're in a hotel room between, a pro tip is you get the chair from the desk, you put the chair on your bed, and then you can kind of like fold your legs around that, and that gets your legs really high, because usually there's not enough pillows to get your legs up high enough that it feels good and for like your head to be there at the same time. So just put the chair on the bed and you're set. Get your Instagram going and tell everyone about how you're going to kill the next stage. Yes, John?
Yeah, that's a critical component there for sure. The one that I would say is so for hotel beds, this usually works unless it has some sort of strange bed orientation. But I actually lay down backwards on the bed with basically like my butt up against the headboard and then my legs up the wall. And you can kind of do something.
This is going to change how everybody, whether anybody wants to lean up against headboards in hotel rooms forever now.
For sure. Yeah. Sorry. But it's definitely, I find benefit from this. And you bring up a great point, Chad. I'm laying down. I'm forcing myself to do that. I have, sure, my legs are up. So yeah, gravity is probably doing some work, but I'm also telling myself that it works. But there is value in that. I think that a lot of the time it's tempting to dismiss it if we make it up in our head, but there is value in that. I think that probably the best champions in the world have told some pretty big lies to themselves all throughout their preparation and their execution for their performance, right? You could call it a lie, whatever you want to call it, but they gave themselves hope in one way or another. And I think that even in recovery, that's important. I feel it. I find this. In fact, before yesterday's workout, I did this very thing. I was running around on my legs a lot yesterday, and I just laid down for 10 minutes with my legs up before I got dressed and got out. And it made I felt like it made a difference. So it's one of these situations where, who knows, even if the science isn't there to actually say that it makes it better, it could help, right, Amber?
Yeah. I just want to revisit what Nate said about the deep vein thrombosis, getting blood clots in the lower legs. This is, I know 5 professional cyclists who have had this happen to them. So this is not something that's just, it's not a fit person's problem. In fact, my understanding is the very fact that high-level athletes have lower blood pressure is part of what puts them at higher risk for DVT. It's not the only thing, and I don't remember all of the science on it, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now, and please take this with a grain of salt, but do know that it is a significant risk. So don't just chalk it up to an old people problem, because it's not.
Yeah. Someone on YouTube said old people. I was thinking 80 plus, right? Of like, there could be a problem. But also just get up. I think the thing is like get up once an hour. Mm-hmm. That's what they say, to like walk around the plane if you can. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is also
Mhm.
good. So I think what Chad said too, flexing the muscles, wear the compression socks, then get up when you can. And another good way to do that is to drink tons of water on the flight. Because a lot of times people end the flight dehydrated because they don't drink any water because they give you these teeny little cups. But that's just a natural thing. Chad, by the way, Chad can sit on the inside window seat for 8 hours and not pee once. It is insane. I don't know how you do it.
That's impressive. I remember flights. Man, do you remember flying and going places and
I do.
all those amazing things? Crazy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Scott's question. So he says, I've seen cyclists start to get into muscle flossing. This is another recovery one. Muscle flossing. Muscle flossing has many claims, such as better recovery, reduced joint pain, creating better blood flow, and ranges of motion. So my questions are, number one, have there been studies done looking into muscle flossing benefits in endurance athletes? And does it provide any greater benefits compared to self-massage or simple stretches I could complete at home? And then the next one, is this something one can do at home or should it be done with a professional? He mentions big fan of the podcast and the YouTube videos. I have yet to really commit myself to a training plan. However, it always feels great to complete a TR workout when I have the time. Awesome. Scott, you can build your own plan even, like look at the plans and use Plan Builder and do a low volume one, and you can pick and choose even. So I'd recommend it. Okay, so muscle flossing. This is one where I've seen it actually, I even get Instagram ads for something where I guess it's technically flossing, but it's a little bit different, which I guess we'll talk about. But Chad, can you explain it? Because I think there is probably some misunderstanding on what it is.
Yes. Yeah. So Scott, you're right. It does have a lot of claims. And this one, there is a bit of science to back up some of those claims. Not a lot, but at least there's something there. And I'm not going to pick them apart, but I'm going to discuss all of them because there's 6. There are, as I see it, there are 2 different types of flossing, because if you're a fan of Kelly Starrett, if you've read any of his books, he basically has his own version of flossing, but he also does the voodoo flossing, this stretch band flossing that we're going to talk about. So I think it's just, basically how severe you make the flossing, or how apparatus enhanced. Both of them do involve movement of some kind, but I think the non-banded versus the banded is really a difference of compression or blood occlusion. So
yeah, for sure.
Yep. So the one type of flossing that Kelly describes is, I think, the more familiar and probably the less painful method, in which you put a joint in a position of emphasis. So basically the position you're trying to stretch, and you bias the joint in certain ways, and then you stretch it under basically a body weight load. So it's just kind of getting in a position that's a little uncomfortable, and then kind of challenging the range of motion, moving through it, find those little sticking points. And that's when I've talked about muscle flossing in the past, or when I've just said flossing, this is the context in which I'm speaking. Nothing so severe, nothing about banding, but that is the alternative. That's what other methods do. Kelly does use the bands that actually pull the joint into a particular bias, if I'm using the term correctly, in that he's looking for joint extraction. So getting a little synovial fluid back in the joint capsule sort of thing. And he uses bands, but like the more workout oriented bands, to pull the joint into that position, and then goes through what I just described, where you bias it and then you move in and out of positions that are a little uncomfortable, and you try to increase the sliding surfaces and all of that. If you want more information on that, any of his books will suffice. The other method is the voodoo floss band. So basically the banded method. It doesn't have to be voodoo. I'm pretty sure voodoo is a brand, but it's used pretty synonymously, because anything that duplicates it or replicates it is the same thing. It's really thin, probably 2-3 inch wide banding, and you basically just wrap it around a joint. You start above it, wrap it at a certain tension. And I think the idea is that you're not supposed to restrict arterial flow, but you do restrict venous flow. And I'm not sure if that just applies to the whole, blood flow restriction training. There's a lot of overlap there, and I found it a bit confusing. So I'll try to steer clear of that so as not to lend confusion to this. But if you look up voodoo flossing, you'll see a lot of descriptions, or a lot of videos actually on what exactly it is. Jonathan?
Yeah, so like this is one where to give people a visual for voodoo flossing, you can Google it and definitely check it out. But at the same time, it's, if you've ever seen somebody wrap their arm very tightly with like very kind of like heavier duty surgical band, it usually is. It's not like something that's like a really light band, but they wrap a portion of their body with that. Like Pete does this all the time. He wraps his quads. and he wraps them very tightly, and it requires a very tight wrap. And then this is before his ride, and then he'll basically just do some air squats to move himself through a range of motion for a while, right? And then after that, he unwraps them. I've tried it. I haven't found much benefit to it. It definitely gave my legs really weird looking lines for a little bit because of just wrapping it so tightly with that stuff. But like the concept, Chad, right, is to, and I guess you'll get right into this with the promises, is to kind of break up those adhesions that may exist between fascia and the muscle tissue itself.
Yep. So this voodoo flossing, if you want a more generic term, you can look up compression band therapy. It's abbreviated CBT, and which actually gets under my skin because cognitive behavioral therapy is like a thing for a million different facets of therapy, and they couldn't pick their own acronym, but it doesn't matter. I'm nitpicking here, but that's another term to search on. And so the promises, and who are we talking to, Stephen? Oh, it's not scrolling. Come on.
Yeah, Scott.
Scott. Okay. So the promises are many, and I think he basically enumerated each of them. And now I've lost my place. Hang on. Okay. So improved range of motion. And this is basically accomplished through, or at least the theory is that it compresses the fascia, so the encasement of the muscle, and then you move through these various problematic ranges of motion. And it's supposed to kind of free up those sticking points, improve the glide and the sliding surfaces, et cetera. So improved range of motion. That's probably its number one claim to fame. Fluid dynamics, which is like an improvement in circulation or lymphatic drainage. Okay. Pain mitigation, and that's claim number 3. Tissue recovery rates, and I think they attribute this to the removal of the compression and claiming that it floods the joint and the muscle with more nutrients and recovery agents, quotes, than usual. So it's basically you occlude the blood flow and then you flood it, hyperemia. So if there's anything to this, we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the 5th claim, and the one I probably struggle with most, is a reduction in DOMS. So delayed onset muscle soreness. So let's get to the studies.
Yeah. Before you get into the studies, I really want to see the battle between toxins and recovery agents. I think that's a real battle, and I'm sure it exists somewhere. Oh boy.
Okay, so as I mentioned,
toxin people
I've got a small handful of studies. There are 6 of them. I'm just going to take away little keys from each of them, and I'm not going to grade them. I'm just going to give them a vote for what do they support any of these promises. First of which was 2018, Gorney and Stogel. They did single leg press, as many reps as you can at 65% of your 1 rep max, and basically exhaustive training. So what they found was that tissue flossing neither improves nor delays regeneration after strength endurance intervals. Tissue flossing has no effect on DOMS reduction. Okay, so there's their findings. So that's 0 votes for reduction in delayed onset muscle soreness, and therefore 0 votes for enhanced recovery, I'm going to say also. The second one, 2017, Driller et al., so Driller and colleagues, they looked at ankles pre and post strength training. They measured counter-measured jump height, and then sprint tests, little 15-meter sprints. And they found that, quote, there's a trend towards a benefit for the use of floss bands applied to the ankle joint to improve range of motion, jump, and sprint performance in recreational athletes for up to 45 minutes following their application. So I'm going to say that's a vote for range of motion improvement, and I'll give them extra credit because they also improved their countermeasure jump and sprinting. But I'm going to take away the extra credit because the effects didn't even last for an hour. Then there's a 2018 study by Prill and colleagues. They did an arm exercise protocol on both arms. One arm received flossing and the other served as the control. They came back the next day and they flip-flopped. So that arm got the flossing, the other arm served as the control. And then the participants related their DOMS on a 1 to 100 scale. And the findings were that at 24 and 48 hours, there was a reduction in DOMS. So they concluded that tissue flossing appears to be an effective method for treating DOMS, which is slightly less effective, but more practicable than gold standard treatment. I didn't want to pay $25 or $50 to find out what gold standard treatment is. And I'm not all that interested since most of the literature seems to say that DOMS is fixed by one thing and one thing only, which is time. But I'm still going to give this a vote for improvement in delayed onset or reduction in delayed onset muscle soreness. Amber?
I just want to point out that there's a major problem with these studies in particular, because it's really hard to do a blind study on this. So I
impossible.
do think that right. So that take this with a grain of salt because there is probably some serious bias involved.
Take all
Just
of
by
these
virtue
with a grain of salt because I think they all suffered from the same major limitation and their data pools were terribly small. And this next one is a perfect example of it. It's a 2014 study by Bolin, 5 participants, 14 days, and they did unloaded leg exercises. So we're talking bodyweight squats, heel raises, active dorsiflexion, which is basically pulling your toes towards your shin, and then passive ankle mobilization, which means someone moved their ankle through a range of motion or perhaps a machine. I don't know. One leg was floss banded and the opposite served as a control. And they found that there were some improvements in strength, but it didn't alter blood flow significantly. So in this case, 1 vote for increased strength. And I would have to attribute that to less restriction in range of motion. And then we had one in 2017 by Borda and Selhorst. This was a case study. So this is looking at one person, but it did find that someone who wasn't responding to traditional physical therapy methods shifted to this compression tack and flossing, which is yet another term for it. And they also used, I think, a lacrosse ball massage. And then 2 sessions later, she was pain-free to the point where she could actually engage in her activity. I think maybe a soccer player, pain-free. So in this single case, methods that weren't working were supplemented with this approach, this banded approach, as well as the lacrosse ball massage. And it's going to earn a point or a vote, for pain mitigation. Again, probably attributed to the unrestricted range of motion. And then finally, there was a 2016 study by Kiefer. This is an observational study. So there was no experiment, rather they just observed people. And they used a ANOVA design, which is an analysis of variance. And they just look at the differences between 2 groups. And they compared the flexibility and the perception of movement, a new favorite term, on glenohumeral flexion, which is basically just shoulder flexion. So being able to raise your shoulder, bring it out to the side, basically anything pulling it away from the body kind of qualifies as shoulder flexion. And the assumption is that one group my assumption is that one group who used the banded flossing was compared to a group who did not. The findings were that they both significantly improved. So whatever the other method was, I don't know, but they both improved their range of motion, but there wasn't a significant difference between the groups. However, in the Voodoo Floss Band group, and they actually did use the Voodoo brand, there was an increased perception of flexibility. So they had a psychological increase in flexion, but not a physical one. I'll give them a vote for increased range of motion and a bonus since it fell on 2 levels somehow. So there's the science, and I'm pretty sure that's all of it. I couldn't find anything else. It kind of started to steer me into that blood flow restriction territory, which is actually really interesting stuff, but it doesn't really have any endurance applications. It's more strength oriented. So my takeaways are this. The research jury's out on benefits, but the anecdotal evidence is actually quite strong, at least for range of motion improvement and pain reduction. Not a whole lot to support the recovery evidence. A couple of them touted, or at least one of them touted, that it must be accompanied by other recovery modalities, which I think just muddies the water and makes you wonder, well, what is it that's actually effective? And yes, to your question, do involve, or at least the advice is to involve a physical therapist initially, both so you understand what you're after, and there are some safety implications because you can't overband it and cause problems. There are certain parts of the body that should not be banded, and it did kind of enumerate some of them, one of them being the neck, which I feel like is kind of a no-brainer, but they felt they needed to state that. So yeah, probably work with a PT.
Okay, so that's like the wrapping up flossing. The other flossing that Kelly Starrett talks about a lot of the time is introducing some sort of pressure point on your muscle with a ball, and then you move it through range of motion to basically make the muscle glide over that ball. But then, so that's the movement one. But then there's another one that I hear people talk about flossing, but really I've heard of it referred to as Graston as well, right, Amber? That's kind of the other side of things.
Yeah, so Graston is, I think it's a trademarked term, but essentially what this is instrument-assisted soft tissue mobilization. So this is where you take some kind of a flat instrument. Some people use a spoon, and you kind of do a scraping motion over the skin, and then this can kind of get you into some of the fascia. And again, the promises of this technique are very, very similar to flossing in terms of increasing circulation and fluid flow, addressing fascial adhesions, trying to get those things to move a little, trying to get the fascia to move more smoothly. And then that, of course, should, in theory, increase range of motion and mobility. And then, of course, one of the corollary promises is the pain mitigation component of this. And honestly, when I was looking in the research at this, I was focusing on review articles, and it looks like for this modality, at least, we're in a really similar situation to the flossing. I think there probably are more studies just in sheer number, but the real problem with this is, number one, what we just mentioned, which is it's impossible to blind these studies because you have a person using a tool on a patient, and you can't pretend that you are or are not using a tool on the patient. So the blinding component of this presents a huge hurdle. That said, you can blind the assessors, and there are different ways of kind of layering in some blindness to these tests. The problem is that most of the studies that are out there are not doing this. They're not doing it consistently. The experimental designs are very, very inconsistent, so it makes it really hard to compare apples to apples. And then there are very inconsistent protocols in terms of, are you using the scraping tool for 60 seconds? Are you using it for 3 minutes? How frequently are you using it? How are you looking at effects within a 24-hour period after the treatment, or just a 30-minute period after the treatment? So there's so much diversity in terms of how the research is being conducted that it's really difficult, even for a review article, to assess what's going on in the research. So even though there are an increasing number of studies, a lot of the early studies on this were on mouse models, and increasingly they're doing these studies with humans in clinical research. But it's interesting that, yeah, it's really hard to have these takeaways. So the big one is that it's almost impossible to get any statistical takeaways from this. So statistical significance is very different from like clinical relevance. And so statistical significance has a really high threshold of, it's basically testing what is the probability that this outcome is due to chance. And the statistical significance is highly affected by your sample size. Clinical relevance is just, is there an effect or not, and how big of an effect is there? And so that can take on, that honestly can even include placebo. So at least one of the more recent reviews said that based on clinical effectiveness, and that's only to say that there was a difference for the people who underwent the treatment. And again, considering that there might be bias involved here, there might be placebo involved here, that it's really difficult to control for those things. There is some evidence for clinical efficacy in terms of increasing range of motion in uninjured patients. There's maybe some evidence for reduction in pain and increase in function in some injured patients. So again, these studies are on really specific, like they're looking at one joint in, 15 people. I'm kind of making this up off the top of my head, but they're looking at really, really specific joints with really, really specific conditions with really, really specific injuries. So it's hard to generalize out of this. So, and then right now there's just really conflicting evidence in terms of increasing strength. So it's one of those things where I think the take home is, if it works for you, great.
I had a PT go nuts on me with, and it was kind of like a spoon-shaped instrument, but smoother all around. And they went nuts on my leg going after when I was, trying to figure out my knee issues. And like all I was left with, excuse me, was a serious amount of pain, a serious amount of bruising. And like it was like really bad. So I personally, to what it's, for an individual anecdote here, it wasn't, I understand the concept in the sense that it's trying to basically apply pressure, just like massage, right? Like it's the same concept, like a productive massage to try to release like fascial adhesions. That's the same concept, and that the instrument's supposed to help with that for sure. But if you are going into it, just know that it can be really painful if you do go through with this. So, and you may just end up hurting a lot and be no better off in terms of the actual injury or anything else you're trying to recover. So tricky for sure. I find it funny that you talked about mouse models, because I'm considering, like, I'm thinking in my mind of them trying to floss like a mouse leg, like, I don't know how that would even work.
I'm really curious to see what that would look like.
Yeah, right. Okay, let's jumping gears from recovery. Let's get into Juan's question. And while I'm saying this too, everybody that's watching on YouTube, you can submit your questions that you have for us, and we're going to answer some of the questions that you've submitted after we cover the questions in our list here. So go ahead and start submitting those. We have producer Tucker from afar going through, and he's actually organizing all of those into our document so then we can read them. So Juan's question, he says, "Hello team, thank you for the great content you put out and for helping me become a better cyclist. It's our pleasure, and that's what we aim for, Juan." He says, "I want to challenge myself by tackling the largest climb on earth." This is probably appropriate for like this sort of time. I see a lot of people picking alternative goals right now, or like things that they probably wouldn't otherwise do. So this is basically your Strava segment, but a very not normal Strava segment. It's called Letras in Colombia, and it's an 80-kilometer, 50-mile long climb. It goes from sea level to 3,600 meters, and its gradient is around 8% with some 9 to 12% ramps here and there. And we'll go over all the conversions and everything else on this in a bit. So he says, "How can I train for something of this magnitude?" And he says it is long, and the lack of oxygen may play a huge role here. So breaking that down for people, that's 82 kilometers, and it's 51 miles. So that can give you a point of reference. And then also that's 3,890 meters, which is 12,762 feet of climbing. So super, super long. Also goes through, and if you look up anything on that climb, it goes through a huge range of experiences in terms of microclimates and everything else that you go through on the way up to this high plane that it ends up going to. For point of reference for all of us here on the podcast, when we did Mauna Kea, or I should say, when I did Mauna Kea, Nate ate a bag of Maui onion chips, I think, in the car.
Family size.
And then, family size. Yep. That was a miserable day, but that one is really similar in a lot of ways. So this climb is 88.5 kilometers or 55 miles, Mauna Kea. And it's just more climbing. So it's 4,356 meters or 14,294 feet of ascent. But Mauna Kea varies more, whereas Letras is much more consistent. And it just kind of keeps on keeping on all the way to the top. So super long climb. Yes, oxygen definitely will play a role. But the pitch does have some variation, but nothing too crazy. It's more just a consistent long climb. Amber, what are your first thoughts when this could be like with courses that you've had when you were racing pro and everything else? Do you have any recon tips for folks on something like this?
Oh yeah. I mean, it depends on the athlete. Some people just, they don't want to know, they don't want to see what's coming, and they'll just tackle it when it gets there. But I really like and do like to recon courses like this, especially if you're looking at creating a pacing strategy for yourself. Because it's really easy to look at, a profile on a map and just say oh, okay, I'm divided up into 4 things and there's a steep pitch here. But what does that mean to you when you're actually on the bike, on the road? So can you actually, I really like using Google Street View for this, and actually following the course through Google Street View, because you can actually find permanent landmarks or semi-permanent landmarks that you could use as cues to know, okay, I'm hitting this section of my pacing strategy. And this means that I'm either going to, this is where I want to settle into a good rhythm in the saddle, or this is where I want to get out of the saddle for a little bit to pick up some speed. But I really like that for me, because for me, just mentally breaking it up into different segments really helps with a pacing strategy. And I think that having visual cues in mind that you almost memorize ahead of time can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, Street View is sweet. It's pretty cool how you can just basically ride through an entire experience and get it figured out. I've even used that for criteriums to look at a criterium course and just to look and to see what the road surface is like. I did that for Giro de San Francisco back when it was just a criterium and still is just a criterium. But with that course, I just wanted to see what it was like. And beforehand, I was able to see the fact that the pavement looked terrible and that there were trolley car tracks diagonally crossing the course and tons of crazy things. So that would have been sketchy, right? So, but it was nice to be able to prepare for that sort of thing mentally instead of just see it right before the race and kind of be panicked. One thing that you can do too is by going on Strava, you can look at those segment performances and you can actually look at a person's performance throughout the climb. And that's really helpful because then but my warning would be not to look at any one person's, but try to increase the sample size, so to speak, and look at plenty so then you can get a more broad perspective. And then one feature that you can actually use if you have a Garmin is their new feature called Climb Pro. So I've used it on my Edge 830 now. I think it's on their 830, 530, and 1030. And it basically, like, as you start a climb, it more or less tells you where you're at on the climb, what the average pitch is that remains, and when it shows, and it basically says like how much further you have. And I think that you have to, from what I can tell, you have to have a route loaded before you start a climb like this. But once you have the route loaded, it can figure out where the climbs are. And then once you're riding on those climbs, it shows you. So I personally don't love that. I like to recon beforehand and then in the moment kind of go off of that, because sometimes just having too much data is tough for me, and too much, I just like to focus on the effort. But at the same time, that could absolutely be a key. So recon's key. And then after that, I feel like it comes down to just like pacing, nutrition, and equipment. And this is a pacing question that we get a lot, is basically like, how does my pacing plan change based off of elevation? As you go up more, like with Mauna Kea, for example, as we went up with that one, your effective ability to, your effective threshold was dropping because of the fact that the elevation was going up and up and up. So even though I could have ridden at threshold down below, it was really tough to do that later on. So it's a lot of this comes into knowing that you're going to have to ride off of a mixture of RPE and power. Like, but also you won't be able to ride at your threshold that you have down at sea level when you get up high anyway. So you don't have to worry about that part. Like, it's not going to happen anyway. You'll feel exhausted and it won't be possible. So you have to expect that it drops down. But with a climb this long, you just have to take like an all day pace. Letras is probably going to be faster than Mauna Kea just because you don't have that dirt section and everything. But still, that was like a 6 hour and 48-minute day for me. That's a climb for me. That's a long climb. And that's an all day pace that you have to maintain. So even though it's a climb and even though you want to go for it and everything else, you kind of have to just settle into that all day pace. It's something that trying to smooth out any sketchy or like, big steep sections or anything else like that does go a long way on something like this. Right, Chad?
Yeah, and don't mistake all-day pace to mean that you can get out there and work at your breathe through your nose sort of ride a flat century pace, because you're working against a grade. And in the case of Letras, you're working at a pretty substantial grade. So it's going to take a hefty amount of muscle endurance. You need to be able to turn big gears slowly, or you need to be geared for it. And it's going to be really tough to gear for 12% climbs where you can spin through them. You're going to have to muscle a big gear a lot of time. So make sure that you've addressed long periods, long intervals at 80, 85, 90% of your threshold, because there's going to be a lot of time spent there. Don't hesitate to address low cadences and up the force side of the equation, and be familiar with moving slowly through, heavy resistance. And also do not neglect, and these are all preparatory sort of mechanisms, not in the moment, but your trunk conditioning, or, most people put it, your core conditioning, because you have to have strong hips, strong back. You have to be stable on the saddle. Either way, those muscles are going to become crucial as this ride goes from 5 to 6 to 7 hours.
Yeah. So, John, this ride is a perfect example of at least a compact and a 32. But John, when you rode Mauna Kea, we put you on a cross bike. Would we give you a 28 in front and a 42 in back? Like
26,
crazy.
42.
26, 42. And that was just right. And John is faster than most people. And so that's just insane to me. So if you're on like a subcompact or something, or you have a 30 in the back, you're going to need, what Chad said, is extreme muscular endurance and be able to ride at like 50 RPM, or else you're just going to blow through it, especially when it gets to 12%. But if you can just spin, John looked funny. Like he was not going anywhere, but he got really. But it's needed, right? Like, because those things on a ride that long, just going above threshold for 3 minutes, like it sucks it out of you. Then doing it over and over again, yuck. John, you have something to say?
Yeah, I was going to say the reason that we went for that low of gearing in this case was because the dirt that existed on that climb, it was like 12% sustained, and it was like it's like deep volcanic ash. So in this case, I opted for that low gearing, and I opted for slick tires. I didn't do a wheel change, so I had like slick tires with low gearing. If I would have had knobby tires, I would have went with higher gearing, right? Just because traction was the main thing I was worried about losing in that scenario. But if it's just road, sure, you probably don't need to put a 26 on. But the point is you need to probably go lower than you think, because I guarantee you're going to get to a point on that climb earlier than you would have anticipated where you hit that sad click, where you click your rear derailleur and nothing happens in back because you're already there. We've always hit that. And then we always, in that moment, coming into it, we're like, no, I'm fine with this gearing. And then in that moment, we arrive at that spot where we run out of gear. So always just give yourself a little bit of extra room, especially since this climb is consistent. Yes, in Letras, there are some sections where it kind of drops down and you can actually carry some speed, but you don't have to worry about that. Like in that moment, it's going to be fine to spin at 120 RPM or 100 RPM for a bit and maybe spin out. It's going to save you more time if you actually have the gears that you need, right, Amber?
Yeah, definitely. I love Janelle Spilker, formerly Holcomb. One of her quotes, I quote her all the time on this one, is never met a gear I didn't like. So usually,
I like that.
And it's never more true than on a really long climb like this. I did want to just mention a couple things about elevation, is to remember, like I think it was Chad mentioned, going over your threshold at some point on this is going to be really, really unforgiving, because you don't have, you're not going to have like a relaxation in the gradient that will give you that recovery. And that's going to be even more true the higher elevations you get to. So the higher you gain in elevation, the less forgiving those little blips over threshold are going to become. So just keep that in mind. And the other thing about the elevation is the higher elevation sea level, I think it's the partial pressure of CO2 that's really driving your ventilation rate. But as you get to elevation, it becomes more about the oxygen saturation. And one of the things that can actually help with that a little bit is to just consciously, not actually hyperventilate, but slightly hyperventilate. Because when you're at sea level, you sort of train yourself to like breathe off carbon dioxide to slow your ventilation and heart rate. It doesn't work as well at elevation. So just allowing yourself to breathe a little bit more heavily at elevation and not trying to slow that with a long exhalation at elevation can actually help a little bit. And then the last thing I just want to say is that you don't have to, no one needs to go out and find an 80K climb in order to train to do an 80K climb. And a really great example of this is a lot of the Belgian pros that live and train in Belgium. I mean, they still climb amazingly well when they, show up for races that have these longer climbs. And the way that they do that is they just do over-geared training. So they'll just throw the bike into a harder gear so that when they're producing power, they're producing at a lower cadence. And that goes back to what Chad and Nate were saying about that muscular endurance. So just training that muscular endurance, you can do it without having to be on a crazy long climb.
Yeah. On the nutrition side, because this is definitely a huge component of this, we should talk about that. I mean, if you're looking at somewhere in between, like, a 5 and an 8 hour day, climbing this one, you have to have your nutrition dialed in. Like, you have to, and it has to be a consistent rate that you're going to be taking in. Otherwise, it's just you're gonna get to a point where you completely run out of gas. Nate, what would you be looking to take in on something where it's like a long, consistent effort like this? What would you do if you're doing Letras?
Okay, so I just have to say this: if you're fat adapted, it's going to be something different. Okay, before people type it in YouTube real fast. I mean, I feel like a broken record, but this would be the same kind of strategy I would do for Leadville. I would do for Dirty Kanza. I do for little Ironman's a little bit different because of the amount of bike versus run. But for me, being an athlete who takes in carbs, I'm not fat adapted. I would be going as much as I could the whole time. I can stick with one fluid the whole time, and I'm pretty good. Hopefully, maybe not every time, but you got to be aware of fatigue, flavor fatigue, solid versus regular food, things that you can do for a long time. Hydration would be huge. Hard part about this too, at a climb like this, is you don't want to carry all of that. So if you can be supported, that would be amazing. When I did Haleakala, I had support, and it was amazing because 8 hours. Think how many bottles you could do in 8 hours, and I'm guessing it's warm down below and then cold up top. You might also need like jerseys and stuff, and I don't want to carry like 4 liters of water on my bike or 5 liters and all the food. So if you can have somebody go in front of you, then you stop and change it all and keep doing the changes as you go up. That would save you a lot of time and make the whole day more enjoyable.
For sure.
Plus,
I really want to do this climb someday. Yeah, I was just gonna say, I really want to do this climb someday. It'd be amazing. It'd be a cool one to do. I've wanted to go ride in Colombia for quite some time, so hopefully we can make that happen at some point in the future. Along these lines, we should mention outside workouts right now, as long as it is safe and legal and appropriate in your region, it definitely is the time of season where you can start to integrate those more. And then, man, like I still don't think enough people use this feature. It's so awesome just to be able to push it directly to your Wahoo or your Garmin. Just go into your calendar and you just flip it, or in the TrainerRoad app, you can just flip it over. If you're using your Windows or your Mac, you can just flip it over to be, you just click outside. And when you do that, it just shows up on your head unit. It's so awesome. So, and I wanted to go through a couple little tips that I have on this. So yesterday I did an outside workout and on Garmin, there's some cool things. So you can actually go onto blog or trainerroad.com/blog. And if you do that, you can see we have, or just search for the TrainerRoad blog. We have an article that's all about how to set up your Garmin with custom fields. If you have an Edge 1030, 830, or 530, you have some new really cool custom fields that make your workout experience really good. You can customize it, and we have kind of a walkthrough. So then you can see everything that you need to. And it's really similar to a TrainerRoad workout in terms of what you see. It's awesome, and I recommend doing that. With Wahoo, a really cool thing is you can skip back and forth with the arrows from one interval to the next. But with Garmin, you can kind of do the same thing in one respect. So like if you just swipe back over to the Garmin screen, there's like a little tab on the bottom. And if you tap that, you can see where you're at in your current workout, progressing through the whole thing. And that's where you can just hit restart current interval. So if you do have a situation where you can't get into position in time, and like, you're doing like repeats that are like short shorts or something like that, you can always just hit that button and it will restart wherever you're at in your current interval. So it's a really good way to make sure that you can still hit your marks. And this is a good way to talk about specificity, since chances are we're all getting closer to the point where hopefully some events or whatever our goal is will happen, right? Whether that's a KOM these days or whatever it is. In that case, it's a good way for you to start to integrate some more specificity. So you can train inside solo when you just need to do those workouts or you just need to focus. You can train inside with a group of people with group workouts, and you can train outside. It's pretty awesome. So I use all three of them in any given week, and it's pretty darn cool. Chad, go ahead.
Can we back up for just a second? Because I want to revisit one of my new favorite terms, which is the sad click. This is totally, it's not completely off topic, but for anybody who's been with SRAM since their earlier days, the sad click used to be the mean click, because you would fish for that last gear, and not only would it not be there, but it would drop you down into a smaller cog. It would move you down the cog set. So they've since fixed it on their journey toward near perfection, but it was like a penalty. Not only was it a sad click, but then it kind of like booted you in the junk and said, nope.
Yeah, I remember that. With the first SRAM, I had like a SRAM Rivals group set or something on my first bike. I remember that. Like, if I would always count my shifts so diligently, because if I didn't and I got there, it would just punish you even more. It was terrible.
I think that was a feature, not a bug. They call that the HTFU click.
Yeah, exactly.
You click and you're like, this isn't possible. And you look down, you're like, this must my you look down, you're like, oh shoot, it's right.
Always. I think like every time I look down, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm already there. Yeah, it's frustrating for sure. So let's get into Will's question. It says, hey, TrainerRoad, awesome apps and podcasts, definitely 5 stars for both. And mentions that actual reviews have been given. Thanks. We appreciate that very much, Will. So Will says, a year ago, I was a power lifter and my endurance was basically non-existent. After finally admitting to myself that I was not, and he says in quotes, a well-rounded athlete, even bordering on unhealthy, I decided to do something about it and got a bike last summer. Long story short, I fell in love and literally dropped the weights in favor of cycling. I've been a TrainerRoad user since September. Awesome. Way to go. I'm glad to have you with us. It says, and currently I'm at a 279 FTP at 155 pounds. So that's 70 kilograms. So that's a pretty darn fit person there. Really fast transition for just doing this for a year. That's really impressive. Yeah. Will also mentions that he's 6 feet, so 183 centimeters, puts him at about 4 watts per kilogram. He says, I finally made my way through the entire podcast catalog and I have a question regarding Coach Chad's strength training benchmarks and recommendations. Due to Chad's influence, I've picked strength training back up part-time in order to maintain some of those benefits. I fully understand that an athlete can't effectively specialize in strength and endurance sports, but I still have pretty decent leftover strength. With cycling as a priority, would I be better off intentionally dropping my lifting numbers down to Chad's benchmarks and slowly lose that extra strength, allowing my slow twitch muscle fibers to catch up, he says? Or should I work to maintain my current strength numbers while my primary focus remains cycling? And then he finally mentions, I fancy myself as leaning more toward a climber or an all-rounder. Being in Colorado, there's always climbing to be had. But all of my 5 rep maxes are 1.5 times the benchmark for sprinters. So he says, thanks, guys. So this is a power lifter, which compact power lifter, right? Like this isn't like somebody that's like doing a strongman competition that weighs around 155 pounds, but a power lifter nonetheless going to cycling. That's not what we often hear about many times. So pretty unconventional. But Nate, what are your thoughts? Because we were talking about this beforehand, and I think we have down into the notes here that basically like this kind of seems ideal, right? Like,
no, this is what Chad's writing for. So in Chad's world, this is like this is Chad's dream. So you are Chad's dream.
A lot of people.
This is what Chad wants. Well, a lot of people, but there's also people like Brandon, he's our resident 5.3 watt per kilo guy who was on the live stream, product manager, and that's at elevation, 5.3 watts per kilo. He does not care one bit about his bench press and squat. He just wants to drop people, right? So
sure.
I'll let Chad take it away because this is a good question.
Well,
and actually, someday I would like to be jacked beyond all belief and still be kind of fast.
Yeah, like this. This is a good question. There's a lot of fruit to be picked here. A couple things I want to address before we really even get into the question is that you state, and I've backed this up in the past, and I want to clarify. I fully understand an athlete can't effectively specialize in strength and endurance sports, and that's true. You can't specialize. You're not going to be the best of one if you still have a healthy dose of the other. However, there is a fair amount of evidence that points to the fact that endurance athletes can get pretty strong. Strength athletes are never going to have, high-level strength athletes are never going to have great endurance, but high-level endurance athletes can get pretty strong. So it's not equal both ways. So let that be a bit reassuring. Secondly, you will seem to be concerned with being a well-rounded athlete. And for that reason alone, yeah, you may fancy yourself being a climber, but I would emphasize the all-rounder aspect of even your cycling, just because you seem to be someone who wants to be represented, or you're pretty good at most things you do and not have a obvious weakness. And for that reason, it's hard for me to get behind ditching strength in favor of the cycling, especially, and I don't know how old you are, but if you're an aging athlete, anything you can hang on to now is absolutely in your best benefit. It's only going to get harder. Sarcopenia is real, and all the deterioration that goes with age is real. And getting that muscle back, yes, you're an advanced lifter and you have been for some time, so it's going to come back to you faster than it would for others, but it's still something you're going to have to earn back. Why not hang on to it now, especially if it's not coming at the detriment of your cycling? And I have to say it's not. If you're already at a 280 FTP, having been with us only since September, and I don't know what your training was comprised of before that, but you're light, you're powerful, and you're really strong. I don't know why you would change anything.
Yeah, it's because Will's in a great spot. Like, I look at this and think like, man, I wish that I could be like super jacked and also be 4 watts per kilogram. That would be really cool. With being 6 foot and 155 pounds means that Will, I assume, is probably a pretty wiry build for 6 feet. Probably doesn't look like some sort of power lifter that would be, the traditional stocky look or anything like that. And this kind of just nails home, though, in the same thing that we've talked about plenty of times. Amber, you've mentioned this too. Whatever your body type is and whatever you are aiming for it to be, it's going to be what it's going to be. And it's going to look different for each person, right? So in this case, Will's coming from a very physique heavy world, coming over into a world that's much more just about the objective levels of performance. But we can't ignore the fact that we definitely have that kind of association of like what a fast cyclist looks like and trying to match what that looks like. So Will, in this case, that's one thing that I would say is, just any sort of pressure you feel about that, don't worry about it. And also, you're just a year into this. We've said this so many times, but there's no reason to make yourself a climber or make yourself an all-rounder at this point. You're pretty new into this. You have a lot of strengths. And when you say an all-rounder, maybe not like a GC guy. I mean, look at, you could be anything you want. So that's just the 2 cents that I would add in. Chad, do you want to talk about the slow twitch fibers kind of assumption that he has?
Yeah, that's one thing. I also want to point out that he's talking about maintaining his current strength. He's not talking about growing it, which means he can shift so much of his training emphasis to endurance adaptation, because the strength components that are already in place are going to stay in place with just a little bit of touch up. He might lose some of it, but he doesn't have to like intentionally neglect it in favor of endurance training. He can still do quite a lot of endurance, touch on the strength side of things in order to maintain. And that's a really easy thing to keep tabs on, right? If your strength's falling, you'll notice it soon. And I just recognize that you can still be a very strong cyclist and probably retain a lot of this strength, considering where you are in terms of your body weight and your height and your already high power. As far as the slow twitch fibers catching up, don't think of it so much as them catching up. I mean, they're going to respond to training. Again, you're only touching on the strength side of systems, so you're just working with the fast twitch fibers minimally. The slow twitch fibers, if you dedicate most of your training time to endurance work, they'll catch up on their own. I don't think you need to tailor anything around it.
One thing I want to say is that, Will, probably your neuromuscular ability as a powerlifter is gigantic compared to like the rest of us. And because you're so light for 6 feet tall, it sounds like, I mean, you don't have a bunch of muscle mass. Like you probably have very low body fat too, but keeping up, to Chad said, like keeping up that neuromuscular adaptations doesn't take a ton of time in the gym. I think that's what Chad's saying is, why not just do that? Not gain muscle, stay at this lean weight, and then add extra cycling volume. If there is a point where you add so much cycling volume where you're extremely tired and you find that your gym sessions take away from your extra cycling and you're okay losing it, you could. But to Chad's point, like, why do it already if it's not happening? Let's just keep it up, because that's Chad's dream. Why wouldn't you want to be able to do, like, I don't know what is
a dream.
5 minute maxes. Yeah, so he's very strong. I want to say we're probably doing stuff in the 400 or 500 deadlifts 5 times, and after 155, which is crazy.
Yeah, and again, keep in mind, Will, that my recommendations are just that. This isn't, in order to be a strong endurance athlete, you can't have more strength than this. There's just, for most people who don't have a strength background, these are good heights to ascend to, or at least to target. And that's my opinion. It is, again, opinion that's based on working with a number of athletes, probably quite a few athletes over the years, and seeing how much the strength adaptations did benefit them, and also recognizing when, maybe it did come at the detriment of their endurance performance. But sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, again, they're just recommendations. So if they work for you, they work for you. But don't go modeling your approach to balancing strength training with endurance training based solely on these recommendations.
If you just search TrainerRoad strength training calculator, you can actually plug in your weight and you can plug in your gender, and then you can see roughly what these strength training recommendations would be. These are benchmarks for strength on specific exercises that we feel like would be good for athletes that are climbers, and then a different set for all rounders and a different set for sprinters. Now, this absolutely doesn't, this doesn't mean that you have to be there. This doesn't mean that you can't be more strong. Like Chad is saying, they're just recommendations. And then as far as on how to reach whatever those are, that's something where we definitely recommend working with a strength coach. In this case, I'm sure Will knows very well what to do to get to that point if he had a focus in powerlifting beforehand. But if you do have a question on that, that's the best approach to do it. And you can also jump over to our forum, because we have a lot of discussion on strength training, a ton of it over there. So if you just go to trainerroad.com/forum, you can find that there. Tons of information. Can I jump back really quick on something with outdoor workouts too? We'll actually have an article that's going to be coming out on our blog here from Megan, where she talks about like best practices and suggestions to make your outside workouts even better. So she's written an article as well that was all about how to basically how to pair your interval structure with the type of terrain that you have around you, which is really cool. So it's kind of like a cheat sheet that you can use to find ones. And then this one is a lot about, we talk about how to safely do it. Then we talk about and how to responsibly do it, especially in these times. But then we also give you like a lot of pro tips that we've gleaned from our staff here. So I'd check that out. Also, something on the other end of things with group workouts right now. first of all, tons of people doing it. It's awesome. Tons of fun. People doing ramp tests and pushing each other up on it. This week was like Testing Tuesday. We called it hashtag Testing Tuesday on Instagram. You can find us on Instagram there at TrainerRoad. And tons of people were sharing how they were doing ramp tests together. Pretty cool. So you can do group workouts now. If you don't know, you can do it in the Windows and Mac app. It's awesome. You can train and get faster with your friends. And you can go on to, I just wanted to reiterate the process to find other people that have group workouts so that you can find people that are doing a similar workout or the same workout or have other people join yours. So if you go on to the TrainerRoad forum and you search for group workout room code sharing, there's a thread, and you can even just search group workout. It'll come up first. And there's a thread that we have that has instructions on it. You basically create a calendar event, and then all you do is you invite a specific URL. And when you do that, it puts you onto the public calendar with other people, so then other people can find your workouts and join you. It's a ton of fun. So in fact, next week I am going to be doing a ride, and I'm just going to put it out here now, and I'll put it up on the calendar. But it'll be Tuesday, April 28th, and it'll be 3 p.m. Pacific time, and I'll be doing Pettit +1. So that's the one on my calendar, and it'd be fun to have some of you folks that are listening to this join me. And the code, even though it'll be in the calendar invite, is 9A2RW9. So Nate, you wanted to say something on this?
Yeah, we have so right now the limit is 5. We're coming out, though, we've been testing a new system that will go to 11. We're able to push it higher than that, and it makes everything a lot better. And then we also, with that calendar stuff, we plan on building that into our product to make it a lot easier to discover workouts. And then also, once our new mobile app comes out, that's going to have a huge update coming no promises, but I'm using it every day, and it's awesome. But once that comes out, then we will work on getting group workouts on mobile. I think an iPad or Android tablet is a really great experience for that sort of thing, but also on mobile, like a phone too. So that's pretty cool. And then there's a lot of little small features. We've got a whole release cycle that we're building through, and hopefully we'll have another update out soon. One thing though is when we do get the 11-person update out, you'll see the app will ask you to update, but it will be a mandatory update for group workouts because we're changing video systems. So if you're on the old system and you say, I don't want to update this, you can't get in the new system. You're going to have to update. And there'll be a gate and it will tell you, but just if you're a user, just when it says update, just update.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Sarah's question. She says, a friend of mine told me to never drink plain water when riding. Basically, have a bottle of Noon or other low-calorie electrolyte drink and a bottle of Tailwind Nutrition, which is Tailwind's like a carb drink, more carb-centric. So she says, I tried it a couple times on multi-hour rides, but found myself wanting plain water to rinse my mouth. And I think we can all relate to that. When water just sounds good on a ride, oh my goodness, nothing is better than cold water when it sounds good, right? So Sarah asks, what does Coach Chad think about this? And what does the research say? Thanks for the awesome podcast and products. 5 stars for sure. So I think even though you asked Sarah what Chad thinks about this, I think we're all probably going to opine on this one for sure. Amber, you've done a whole lot of races where you've probably been in situations where you've gotten bottles, but also probably been in situations where you've been desperately wanting water and desperately wanting drinks, probably a whole lot more than the rest of us. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. And we'll get Chad to jump in on this too. But my first question is, I'm curious what the motivation was behind your friend's advice. And so I would say my first thing is there's nothing wrong with plain water. Water sustains life. Water is awesome. But it can be problematic if that's the only thing that you're taking. Yeah, right.
Sorry. The essence of
wetness.
Oh
man, so many references going through my head right now. Oh man. No, but the point is that there's nothing wrong with it, but it can be problematic if it's the only thing that you're taking in on the bike. So again, I don't know if she was mentioning this to you because she felt like you weren't taking in enough fuel in terms of carbohydrate, or if you weren't hydrating well in terms of replacing electrolytes. So I just wanted to talk about 2 sides of that coin. So when you're riding, you're burning fuel, which is mostly going to be carbohydrates in the form of glycogen. And then you're also going to be losing fluid and electrolytes. And so the fluid component of that is mostly water. And then there's an electrolyte component, which is mostly sodium. And I'm a fan of just a simple approach, which is give the body what it needs to do the work that you're asking of it. So if it's burning through fuel and you're losing fluid and electrolytes, you want to give the body more fuel and you want to replace what's being lost. So the carbohydrate fueling, just think of it like you're asking your body to write a lot of checks. So you want to keep on making those deposits, put money in the bank so you can keep on writing those checks. And then the electrolyte balance, that's the fluid and the electrolytes in tandem. So I'll talk about carbohydrate fueling first. I won't go too deep into this because we've talked about this forever. But one of the things I just want to reiterate on this one is don't diet on the bike. So, stepping back, a lot of people get into cycling. It's a wonderful sport. I love it. But there's a sense of like, okay, I want to get really fit. I want to, lose weight. I want to chase a particular body ideal. So first of all, it's not always the case that you need to create a caloric deficit. Not everyone needs to. I think we get so bombarded with diet culture, our internet feeds, almost every kind of media that you can consume is going to bombard you at some point with something to do with losing weight. And in some cases, yes, that's a good thing and it's a good goal to chase, but it's not always necessary and it's not always the thing that you need. So, that's the first assumption that you need to question. And going back to something that Jonathan touched on earlier, if you're getting into cycling, there can be just these preconceived stereotypical ideas around what your body should look like if you're a fit cyclist. Everybody's different. So just give your body the fuel that it needs to do the work that you're asking of it and chase the performance, fuel the effort that you're trying to do. So I really like the idea of shifting your focus to what your body can do. So the fact that you can get out and ride, that's pretty amazing in the first place. And then, focusing on how awesome it is that you have this capacity to improve. So when you give your body the fuel that it needs, you put that money in the bank so you can write those checks in training, you're going to have a better workout on the day. A better workout on the day means you're going to have a better workout tomorrow, because if you fuel your workout today, you're going to be better recovered when you tackle your workout tomorrow. That's going to build out a really good week. That's going to build out a good month. And before you know it, you're going to have built out a really good season. So that's my take on it. I like to chase the performance, chase the effort. And that has a lot to do with putting the money in the bank so you can write those checks in your training. So shifting away from the carbohydrate aspect of this, and that's the tailwinds component of what you're now carrying in your bottles. Let's talk about the fluid and electrolyte replacement. So the fluid loss is mostly water, and that's going to cause a decrease in blood plasma volume, which is really kind of the metric of your hydration status. So water is fine. It's fine as long as you have enough sodium on board, right? So if you are getting enough sodium in your normal diet and you're just the meals that you're eating off the bike, you're probably fine with water to hydrate. If not, if you need more electrolytes than normal, let's say you're in particularly hot conditions, or it's a particularly long ride, or you've been eating a low sodium diet for some reason. But if you need a little bit of extra sodium and electrolyte, Noon is a good thing. There's a lot of different products on the market that will focus on that. So among those products, you can have things that focus only on electrolytes and hydration. There are some that'll be a combination of electrolyte and carbohydrate in the same drink. Just figure out what works for you. But there's nothing really wrong with water. I think the main thing is make sure that you're getting enough fuel on the bike, that you're maintaining a reasonable electrolyte balance. And going back to that comment that don't diet on the bike, if you are chasing a calorie deficit of some kind, don't use your ride as the time to create that deficit. Fuel the effort on the bike and then create that deficit in other meals off the bike. So you want to really fuel appropriately before, during, and after your ride, and then create a deficit elsewhere in your day. There's a lot more on the hydration component of this, and I want to let Chad take over on this because he definitely has some great stuff I know he's touched on before.
Yeah, I've only got a little bit actually, but I think maybe some of this confusion stems from the Noakes controversy. So Timothy Noakes, a well-known and respected in a lot of circles researcher and athlete, put forth the idea in a book called Waterlogged, which, to the tune of 400 plus pages, that we really should be able to drink ad libitum or drink to thirst. And I can't disagree with that. So much of that works, but where it breaks down is in endurance events. And where it especially breaks down is in long endurance events, especially ones done in the heat. So yes, you may be able to simply drink to thirst, and a lot of the times that can just be water, especially again if your sodium levels are sufficient. But if you're going to take part in something, any long endurance event or Ironman, where you don't address your hydration just as well as you address your nutrition, you're basically setting yourself up for a very tough day, if not, a race failure. I can't think of a story, an Ironman or a longer endurance event story that ever started with, I didn't have a nutrition plan, I didn't have a hydration plan, and the day went perfectly. Nobody said that, because you have to plan for those things, because they're severe undertakings. And if you don't know what you're going to eat, when you're going to eat, how much you're going to eat, how that's going to change over the course of the day, how you're going to hydrate, what your sodium loss rate is, what your sweat rate is, what the conditions are. I mean, all these things need to be taken into account to make a day that's as long and as challenging as those days are successful.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to say one thing talking about this is people should just be aware of something called hyponatremia. And that's where you drink so much water that you lose salt in your body, and it can be fatal. There's someone who died in the Chicago Marathon. It's not very often, but there are different degrees of it too. Another thing looking up on this, that women that are on their period are actually more vulnerable to hyponatremia too, which is pretty interesting. That is something to think about. But one thing, looking at the symptoms for hyponatremia and heat stroke, they're very similar. So what you don't want to do, so I'm going to say them, but what you don't want to do is, someone has heat stroke, let's give them a lot of water, right? And they might have hyponatremia because they've already had a lot of water, and you might be making it worse. So for hyponatremia, you might have nausea and vomiting, headache, confusion, loss of energy. And then it goes down to seizures and coma and stuff when it gets really bad. But for heat stroke, you get altered mental state, you nausea and vomiting, and you get a headache. So I would just say that if you think you're experiencing a heat stroke, add some salt to it. There are salt pills you can use. There's electrolyte drink that we talked about, but I don't think you're going to do any damage by adding some salt or a little bit of sports drink if you think you have heat stroke. And you might actually absorb water and cold water better with some salt and sugar in it. I mean, you will. So just everyone just be aware of that if you think someone's experiencing heat stroke, don't just give them like gallons of cold water thinking that that's going to then lower their core body temperature and get them out of trouble.
Yeah. Assuming that the Ironman, I should say all the triathlons that we do, when we do those in a couple of years, assuming that those are in hot conditions or warm conditions. If you can't join on YouTube, Nate's eyes just got as big as saucers, by the way. So, but I tend to just lean on the carb side, right? Like Amber, you're talking about the carb side, and then the more the electrolyte side in terms of mixes. And I tend to lean just more on the carb side, and I'm getting sodium still through taking in a carb mix, right? At least I drink Marten, it's in there. If you drink Beta Fuel, it's in there, that sort of thing. Most of them have some sort of sodium in there. Whether that matches your sweat rate is a different thing entirely. And you can tune into the podcast episode we did with Andy Blow from Precision Hydration. I thought he did a fantastic job of kind of clarifying a lot of those issues and just showing what we do know and what we don't know as far as how the human body sweats and how to manage the whole thing. But something with that really quick though is, I guarantee once we get into more multi-sport stuff, just because, talking about going for a long day, something like a full distance triathlon like that, toward the end, I'm probably, I always say, don't let palate fatigue get in the way of a good result. It'd be a shame to let, pickiness do that. But at the same time, I'm sure that that's when I'm probably going to want to mix in more of those electrolyte drinks or something like that. That's a slightly different taste profile, maybe a bit less heavy on the gut, that sort of thing to mix it up. So I just want to acknowledge something. I'm probably guilty of just saying, just take carb drink all the time and leaving out that perspective. I understand that there's totally a place for both of them. Chad, you were going to say?
Yeah. While we were on the topic of Andy Blow and the guys at PH, so the folks at PH, one of his articles did point out that, while exercise associated hyponatremia is a very serious risk and something you should absolutely be aware of, it's not fatality resulting from it is not as common as you might think. Since 1981, there have been 14 deaths in endurance sports. With that said, and I'm not trying to diminish the importance of those, it's a very big deal, no lie. However, it's commonly more seen in basically degrees of it. So when they do poll people, I'm not sure how they measure it, but they look at people finishing an Ironman distance race, and roughly 10% of them suffer from some level of exercise-associated hyponatremia. So they're on that path. They're not getting to a point where they're necessarily in a dark or fatal place. However, they are suffering to a degree, which means they didn't get their sodium balance right, which means this is something that needs to be looked at. And it's really simply done too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, should we go into some live questions that people have submitted? We have a lot of them. We're only going to be able to get to a handful here because we've gone long this week again. But just the same, Johnny G asks basically about his recovery week feels harder than usual. I'm going to skip that one because hopefully the first one helped you out a lot on this one. But Marco's question where he says, "Hey guys, have you got some tips in order to manage cortisol levels? Tips or supplements to manage that? Do any of us do anything individually to manage that? And sleep's huge. Period." But
Carbohydrate.
I don't measure my cortisol levels, so I don't know what they're at. But in general, it's just reduce stress, rest, all that sort of stuff. And cortisol levels can fluctuate wildly throughout the day, so it's really hard to like. I mean, I wish I would have some kind of thing connected to me that could tell me all the time. But you can't just do it like once in the morning and know your cortisol level for the whole day. So on this, to me, this question is more of how do I manage stress? And that's probably a good thing of just Googling around of how to measure stress and relax and that sort of thing, recover.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you can definitely get.
Amber,
I was just going to say, if you're really concerned about it from like a medical perspective, you can do cortisol test, and I think it's just like a cheek swab. It's a saliva test, but you do, as Nate said, you have to take samples like at certain points throughout the day to see how your cortisol levels are changing throughout the day. So, I mean, if there's something seriously wrong, that's one way to just quickly rule out anything serious. But other than that, yeah, just parasympathetic, sympathetic balance.
Yep. Steve asks, do you have any suggestions for preparing for a hilly fondo? In his case, he's doing the Hincapie Greenville fondo, especially given we're 26 weeks out from that happening and from that possibly happening. So I understand the premise of this question, right? Because fondo is usually seen as like long, steady power, but in this case, it's over hilly terrain. So number one, use Plan Builder. It'll be awesome for you. Number two, even though it's hilly terrain, it's not like you're going to be punching all day, right? Like Amber, you've done. You even live in a place where it's just you're always going up or down, right? Where you're at, so it's not as if you're constantly punching way above, right? You still smooth those things out, or that should be the aim.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we live where I live in Connecticut. It's very sawtooth profile, so definitely still trying to achieve as smooth a power output as possible when doing long efforts like that.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, Steve, it's still about, muscular endurance. It's still about, it's going to be an aerobic effort. It's not like you have to train to be punching over and over or do anything, I would say, even totally unique for that. As long as you're doing a good job of pacing. I see a lot of people go into situations where maybe they have a hilly profile like this, and then they don't race it with proper pacing. And then they think, oh, my training was terrible. It was totally wrong. When really the execution was probably the part where you actually had a bigger failure point than the preparation. So separating those two things, proper training doesn't mean that you can just execute however you want. Proper training will get you to the point where you can execute properly, right? And that's something to keep in mind. It'd be great if we could just ride however we wanted and suffer no consequence. And on hilly terrain, it's really hard to kind of rein it in, but it pays off for sure. By the end of the day, you'll be doing a whole lot better if you ease up on some of those steep sections and then keep the gas on when you're going over on the hills. So over the top of the hills and on the descent. Okay, let's just do one more. This is probably going to be some sort of a controversial one, but I'll jump in anyway. It's from I am Jabba the Cat, or the Jabba Cat, whatever that means. Says a question: any advice on heart rate not rising, and does that mean you are fatigued? So we see that we see that question submitted somewhat regularly. And we even have like a video where we talk about heart rate versus power, where you can see that on YouTube, and we discussed that kind of that very thing. But what does that mean, Chad, when you see that your heart rate, I assume not rising means not rising to the normal levels you would expect, not just not rising, period. But
yeah, or put simply, you're flat. So it's basically an internal indicator for fatigue. I mean, if you can't elevate, then it can mean other things. It can mean, geez, I'm trying to figure out how hydration impacts heart rate. Yeah, typically, well, in that case, it'd be higher heart rate. Or nope, that doesn't wash. But it's fatigue. So we use power, we use pace, we use so many things to measure the external outcome of what our bodies are capable of, but we don't have too many insights into what our body is experiencing. Heart rate is one of those things. So if your heart rate's low, this can be an indicator that maybe you're a little too overreached and it's time for a bit of rest. If you can't elevate, it could be due to perhaps just a bad night's sleep, just a couple too heavy workouts leading into it. But and on a day-to-day basis, maybe not worth that much concern. But if it's a trend, if it sticks for a day or two or three in a row, then you might be just a little too far overreached.
It can also mean that you're more fit. So if on the regular, like your aerobic ride, you're 10 watts lower after a recovery week, well, you might be more fit and it might not be fatigue. Because
yes,
I like to look back at my first training and I was doing like 100, my FTP was 180. And that was like my watts were 180 and my heart rate was 190, right? And now I can do a lot more watts for that same heart rate. And that's just always fun to see.
Hydration levels can absolutely affect it in the opposite direction than you were pondering, right, Chad? In the sense that,
yes.
But I should say basically any nutrition intake can affect this. Heck, even levels of sleep, elevation, plenty of stuff. So
caffeine.
It's tough. It's really always tough for me. Like whenever I see my heart rate data, I'm like, that's neat. I'll keep that there and I will place all the asterisks around it as well. And my life just is not, I guess, consistent enough. And I think I have a pretty consistent life in terms of training and nutrition and everything else, but I still don't feel it's consistent enough to put like all my stock into the heart rate basket and say, that means this, it's pretty tough to do. So anything else to add to that one from any of us here? Cool. We're all covered. Well, thanks everybody for joining us on YouTube and joining us on this podcast, listening through whichever app you're using. It's awesome. We appreciate you sharing it. If you're watching right now, give us a thumbs up. That will help that video a ton. We appreciate that. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can go to our blog and subscribe there. So then you get updated when we post new stuff. You can go to TrainerRoad and subscribe and become a faster cyclist, the whole thing. So that's our goal here, is just to make you all faster. And we'll talk to you all next week. Thanks, everybody. Chat soon.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.